بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وآله وأصحابه وأزواجه وذريته أجمعين. اللهم أرنا الحق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه وأرنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه. اللهم أرنا حقائق الأشياء كما هي. اللهم ربنا زدنا علما وعملا وإخلاصا يا رب العالمين. اللهم انصر أولياءك في غزة وفي كل مكان. اللهم فرج عنا وعن إخواننا في غزة وفي كل مكان. اللهم نفس كربنا وكربهم وثبت أقدامنا وأقدامهم والطف بنا وبهم يا أرحم الراحمين. وصل وسلم على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وآله وأصحابه وأزواجه وذريته وإترته وأوانه وأنصاره أجمعين برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. ولعنة الله على أعدائهم أجمعين برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. Okay. So we have one aspect of being a state that is sometimes considered best identified by the concept of sovereignty. That's one aspect of being a state that is sometimes considered best identified by the concept of sovereignty is its territoriality. So one aspect of being a state is that it is something considered best identified by the concept of sovereignty in its territoriality. So sovereignty. Okay, let's see. People belong to a state by virtue of their residence within borders, and states, it is argued, exercise authority over those within its geographical bounds. While it is important to recognize that a state must possess territory in order to exist, they are not unique in having geographical extensions. So that territory is not unique to states. But it might be unique in the way a state is related to a territory. Provinces, townships, and supranational entities such as the EU are also defined by their territories. Moreover, residence within certain borders does not make people members of the state any more than it removes them from the authority of another under whose passport they might travel. Moreover, residence within certain state does not make people member of the state. It depends on your status, obviously, any more than it removes them from the authority of another under whose passport they might travel. So you might. But that's just missing the point, I guess. Nor is the state capacity to control the movement of people within or across its territory essential to its being a state. Nor is the state capacity to control the movement of people within its territory essential to its being a state. Sure, let's see what the point he's trying to make. For many states have relinquished that right to some degree by membership of other houses. So I think this is also a bit what fallacy is that? Missing the point or something like that. Or red herring. Because those are voluntary things. because if a state cannot, okay, let's finish it and then we'll look. We go through it one by one. To exist, the state must have territory. Okay, that much and the state must have territory to exist. Number one, but not entire oversight. What does entire control mean? Absolute. I think it's the same mistake he's making, which we identified last time. We'll look at that in a minute. There are distinctions which should be made between ideal and the actual control, and then voluntary or potential control and actual control, as well as some part of control which states may relinquish knowingly and by their own choice. That's different from that. So Weber's well-known definition of the state as a body having a monopoly on the legitimate use of physical forces in a given territory is also inadequate. The extent of a state's control, including control means of using violence, varies considerably with the state, not only legally but also in fact. So that's just, I think, bad reasoning. Though they are supreme corporate entities, states don't always exist in isolation. And usually state stand in some relation to other forms of political association beyond the territorial borders. States may belong to international organizations such as the United Nations or alliances such as NATO. They may be part of supranational associations that are loosely integrated defense and trading blocs like ASEAN, or more substantially integrated governmental associations such as EU. They might be members of international regimes such as the International Refugee Convention as a result of agreement they have entered into. A state might also be part of empires or operate within the sphere of influence of the powerful states. The state might exist as associated states, such as the case with Philippines, which was from 1935 to 46, the first associated with Filipino state was responsible for domestic, but the U.S. handled for it. So that means it's not fully a state. Especially if it is due to the weakness of Filipino states. Even today, though, in different circumstances, the foreign relations of a number of states are handled by other states. Spain and France are responsible for Andorra, Switzerland for Liechtenstein, France for Monaco, and India for Bhutan. So that means those are not fully fledged states, especially if they are doing it. Like, for example, Kuwait and these small states. States only in certain aspects. So they might be state vis-a-vis their citizen, but with the help, but from as far as outside is concerned, they are not full-fledged states. So so the aspect issue also comes in, which we discussed the last time. It's a very weak form of reasoning, all these last 2 pages. Puerto Rico, for example, is an unincorporated territory of the United States whose residents are unenfranchised American citizens enjoying limited social security benefits, but not subject to federal income tax. It is unlikely to become an independent state, so you can't call it a state. The state is in the end only one form of political association, so But in our existing system today, it is the basic form of politicalism, most basic and more fundamental form. Indeed, the range of different forms of politicalism government can administer is astonishing. Not really, because one of the limits of we'll come back to it. One of the limits of the current system is, although like capitalism is universal by its very nature, it cannot transcend the fact that the state is essentially national. So America, the main imperial state behind capital. Capitalism requires it to be act as a universal state, but America is essentially a nation state, and that is the limitation. So one of the limitation of the current capitalist system is that we haven't transcended. It is not able to transcend the fact that the basic political association, the state remains the basic political association. So there's nothing astonishing. What is astonishing is that this system cannot transcend the fact that the system cannot transcend the fact that the state remains the basic political association. The reason for paying the states as much attention as it is given is that it is, in spite of a variety of other political forms, the most significant type of human collectivity at work. Yeah, the most significant. So, and fundamental type as well, because other association won't exist without these states. So those association exist because of the fact that a number of states or certain important and powerful states wants them to exist, and they exist to the extent that they are reliant on those powerful states. Yeah, so let's go through these. So in the last paragraph, he had discussed the concept of sovereignty. Which he said it's of limited use, but obviously we disagreed with him. And he had defined sovereignty as supreme authority within a territory. So that's where we transit to a new concept of territory. And that's an essential element of a concept of a state. A state cannot exist without territory. And you can't have sovereignty without a territory, because it is the territory on which the sovereignty is exercised, so supreme authority over a territory. So from there, he goes on to trying to problematize the concept of territory. And basically he says, like the concept of territory, he says that, it is essential, but it is he says that while it is important to realize that a state must possess, so he concedes that a state must possess territory in order to exist. So I think that's how much we need. There's nothing else to say in this regard, because that means that territory is essential for a state to exist. And what he says after this actually is irrelevant, in the sense that that doesn't basically change this basic fact. So he goes on to say that while it is important to recognize the state must possess territory in order to exist, they are not unique in having geographical extension. So the states are not unique in having. So what? States are not unique in having. But states are unique in having. So for example, even if you have a association, that must require some sort of office, for example. So that doesn't mean that a particular association, political or apolitical or unpolitical, has the same relationship with this block of land which a state has. A state has a unique relationship with territory, which no other political association can have. And that unique relation is that it, at least in principle, it has supreme authority over that territory. It has absolute authority over that territory, absolute authority over the people, their movement. How much a state can actually exercise or want to exercise that territory will determine how powerful that state is, or whether the state. So a state can claim to be a state, but that doesn't mean that every state is actually a full-fledged state, for example. So that these two things shouldn't be confused. That's the first thing. The second thing is, what a state does voluntarily is not the same thing as what it is compelled to do. So, for example, a state allows its citizen to go overseas. So, in that sense, this overseas person doesn't live in a state's territory, and it lives in other state's territory. So, just by living in that territory doesn't make him or her a citizen of that state. That's fine, but it is understood that this overseas person, with the permission of this state, has gone to that territory, and its relationship with this residential territory is different from its relationship with its original territory. So that's one thing. And the second thing is, we should never mix factual power of a state, even the strongest state, and its ambitions. Even the most powerful state, for example, America, has practical and factual limitations on its power. That's understood. But factual powers are not necessarily or the lack of the factual limitations are not the same thing as de jure and ideal limitations and the ambitions of a state. So American state is absolute. sovereignty over its territory, its citizens. That is its ambition. That is its ideal. That's its nature as a state. But how much factually it can do that will determine its actual status as a state, whether it is a full-fledged state or not, whether it's a powerful state or a weak state. So all these distinctions, this author has sort of confused those distinctions. Okay. And also the fact that America is a state, nation state. And that's its limitation. But that doesn't deny the fact that it also, in a certain way, a universal state, in the sense that it basically projects its power and its right to defend its interests and all those things throughout this world, not just this world, but universe as well, like even in space. And obviously, these universalist ambitions at times conflict with its status as a nation state. And also, the universalist ambitions are not full-fledged and not consistent because they are not explicitly embraced, for example. So there are all sorts of contradictions there. So just the fact that a state is a nation state also doesn't necessarily mean that that state doesn't have any other aspect. It's not a universalist state, for example. And also a state can be, for example, a state like Kuwait or Bahrain or Qatar, for example, or Monaco or Liechtenstein or whatever it's called. The fact that aspects come in, so they might be state vis-a-vis their internal a relationship between their citizens and their internal boundaries vis-a-vis their citizen, but they might not be full-fledged state vis-a-vis American and other imperial influence, and in relation to other states, for example, Kuwait, couldn't defend itself against Saddam, for example. So with Iraq, it was a very weak state, even though its ambition are no different from the ambitions of Iraq or anything else. But vis-a-vis America, it can't, withhold those, can't defend those ambitions. So it voluntarily, or not voluntarily, but out of necessity, it's forge a relationship with the American state, where American state defends Kuwait as a limited state, which has absolute power over almost absolute power, similar power as other state over its citizens, but doesn't have any of those powers vis-a-vis America and so that's another aspect. So these shouldn't be confused. And some state might not be real, any state in real sense, like Andorra or other state he's talking about, or Philippines in 35-46. So those were not full-fledged state, not even a state in the fully independent state in the usual sense of the word. They were nascent state, maybe within the imperial influence, or only state to certain extent, or to the extent that its imperial state allowed it to be. So they weren't. So Philippines in 1935-46 wasn't a state even in the sense in which Kuwait is a state, for example. So it was only responsible as domestic, but U.S. handled foreign and military affairs. So it means that it's not full-fledged state even in the limited sense in which Kuwait is a state, for example. That's because it is essentially occupied by another state. And for example, the relationship between Spain and Portuguese and France and Spain and Andorra or Switzerland with Liechtenstein and Monaco and India with Bhutan. So you can't call them full-fledged states, especially if they are subservient to other state is non-voluntary, not out of choice but out of necessity. Okay, so and lastly, with Weber's definition also, he makes the same mistake. Let's look at the Weber's definition and then we will finish at that. So he said that, I think at the back, Weber's well-known definition of the state as having state as a body having a monopoly on the legitimate use of physical force in a given territory is also inadequate. It's not inadequate because, again, Weber's definition point to an essential and very important element which makes or constitutes a state. At least monopoly over the legitimate use. So you might still have rebels and all that, but their use of force is not considered legitimate. You still might have gangs and bands, physical force over a specific territory. And obviously physical monopoly of physical use is limited by, for example, maybe limited by morality and also maybe limited by morality and also international law, etc. But that's in a sense voluntary, and in the state of exception, for example, or the states which are in a permanent state of exception like Israel or the US, they use that monopoly, as you can see, and that's one of the defining element of a state, legitimate use of force. But this author, he called this inadequate because he confuses between factual monopoly and ambition. So every state aspires to have a full control over, monopoly over legitimate use of physical force. Every state, by its nature. But how much a state factually can do it will determine whether it's a full-fledged state or a strong state or a weak state, or is claim to the mantle of statehood is just a claim and not actually a substantiated thing or substantiated facts. So Weber's definition is not inadequate for the reason, at least not for the reason which this author has, because factual limitation doesn't mean that this is not what a state actually in its essence try to be. So to the extent that a state doesn't have a monopoly over physical force, it lacks the fullness as a state. Okay, I think this is enough. So next time, inshallah, we will continue from the next section, the third section, which is on the theory of the states. So the next time, inshallah, we will start from a theory of the state. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك وصلى الله تعالى على سيدنا مولانا محمد وآله وصحبه وأزواجه وذريته أجمعين برحمتك